Welcome back to our podcast, Coffee and Cybersecurity with Cyberpilot. I'm your host, Anders, and for the third time in a row, I got Rasmus with me, who's the CEO of Cyberpilot. So welcome back.
Thank you very much.
In the last two episodes, we talked about risk analysis and a plan, do, check, act cycle, which is good ways of getting started with your cybersecurity work. Today, we're going to talk about how to do a security policy, because we want to stay here with the basics and the whole foundation for security work. And having a good policy at your company for how you do security is a good step in that foundation.
Yes.
So maybe we should start with, why do you even need a security policy?
Well, a security policy is a really good way of aligning what is our ambitions regarding cybersecurity, information security in our organization, and on an overall level, who's responsible for what.
Yes.
And I see in a lot of organizations, they jump directly to kind of guidelines for employees. What should you do? What shouldn't you do? You can use this Wi-Fi. You can't use that Wi-Fi. You should always keep your device updated, etc., etc. And then when I ask them, well, but what is your overall objectives regarding your information security? They say, well, we haven't kind of taken the decision around that. And then the obvious next question is, well, then how do you make sure that the guidelines you have for employees or for your systems, actually, when are they a success? How will you ever figure out if you are doing too much or too little, if you haven't set on what is actually our objective? So I think it's a really good way of creating that alignment between the different layers in your organization. Is when are we actually satisfied with the work that we are doing within information security?
Yes, so that is actually also what it is. It is a piece of paper, a document, like laying out what is the whole goal and who is responsible for what and everything in your company.
Yes.
And that's also why we have you with us here 3 times in a row, because this is the foundation. We are once again trying to force you into the helicopter level, to say we need to have these things in place before all the actual work that most people want to do gets started.
Exactly.
Yes. And for the whole, what is a policy and what is a guideline thing, I think we will pause the whole guideline things for now. We can come back to that in another episode maybe. So now we will just focus on the policy itself.
Yes. Yeah, because honestly, the guidelines and kind of establishing good guidelines for employees is also very important.
Yes.
But it should come in kind of a natural order, where you first kind of settle on your overall framework for IT security, and then you can move on to the guidelines afterwards.
Yeah. So I think I've also written down a small note, like, are there any important rules when making a security policy? And I guess one of them is, it's not guidelines.
Exactly. Yeah. So it shouldn't be the security policy is not the policy where you define what you can and what you can't do and how you do specific things.
No.
And also, I think it's also important to say, well, if you actually started doing guidelines, well, you can still go back and do the policies. It's not like, say, well, I started with doing guidelines, so it's over for me. Then it's just, well, the sooner the better you can start kind of establishing a good information security policy, the better.
Yes, and then you can always revisit the guidelines you already did.
Exactly.
Another important rule is that it shouldn't be too long, because then it will just end up in a desk where nobody will look at it.
Yes.
It needs to be quite quick and fast to get through. And then it also, I've written down, it should fit your current state and not some kind of dream case scenario.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is it's not a vision document where you say, well, somewhere in the future we want to be able to reach this state. It should be more practical, saying, well, what is it actually we want to reach right now?
Yes. And just like we did with the risk analysis, we actually have a template on how a template like this, how a policy like this can look like. So I'll drop a link in the description, and then you can also follow along with the things we're talking about. And you can also take it and copy it and then adjust it into how your company is looking.
Yes.
So basically, our security policy template consists of 8 different things. So we have 8 steps to go through, and some of it we'll run quickly through, and some of it we spend a little bit more time on because that's also where the actual work maybe is in the policy.
Yeah, and then for most of these steps, there's basically the only thing you have to do when using our template is replace the X with the name of your own organization, and then you're done with that step.
We've made it that easy for you.
Exactly.
So download it and have a look at it if you don't already have a policy. But let's jump to the first step. The first thing you need to define in your policy is what is the purpose of the policy.
Yes. Yeah, so that basically, why am I reading this document? When I pick up this document, what should I find? And in our template, it just says, well, the security policy defines the framework for the management of information security in insert your name.
Yes.
Of the organization of your name.
Yeah, so it's pretty
name of your organization, sorry.
So it's pretty much just like a formalia kind of thing. It's not something that needs to be defined that precisely for your organization.
Exactly.
It is because it is like a document that is kind of official in that way. So some of it is a little bit boring in that sense. But the second step is the validity, which is kind of also one of the things that just needs to be there. So who does it apply to in the end?
Yes, and for as a starting point, our recommendation is that you should try to define that the security policy applies to everyone, and also you could also extend it to like external consultants that are in essence have the same rights and same access as your employees.
Yeah.
But try to think of it as what these are the things that we really want that applies for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, so you could actually say that if you have external people who have access to your systems, then they maybe make sense to have in it.
Exactly.
But that's also a pretty straightforward point. But the third point is, or the third step, is where all the fun starts, because this is where you have to define all your objectives.
Yes.
So this is where the goal setting also comes into play.
Yes. Yeah, so this is where you really have to start thinking about, well, what do we want to achieve when we work with information security in our organization? What is the goal? When is it enough?
Yeah.
What is the outcomes we want to achieve? Because again, that's really up to like each organization to define. And also there can be different kind of levels of ambition in terms of information security.
Yeah, so this is where you shouldn't go with a dream case scenario. You need to figure out what is actually realistic ambitions for these objectives.
Exactly.
Could we have an example or two maybe, just to make people what could it be?
Well, we could one of the examples could be, well, do we have an objective to actually work with a information security framework?
Yeah.
Like ISO 27001. That could be an objective that you really set forward to say, well, we aim to follow this guideline, to follow this framework when we do all our information security work. It could also be it could be NIST frameworks that you picked out. It could be kind of simple principles, but really say, well, this is an objective. We want to reach this. Makes it very clear. Also, when we come a little bit further down in the policy, it also says who does what. It also makes it easier. Maybe also, well, if this is actually the ambition, if this is the objective, then we also need to make sure that the right people are responsible for it, and that those people also actually get the right resources for that.
Yes, and it's no secret that you are the one who wrote this template that we've done, and I also think it's kind of fun with one of the objectives, which is an example. Of course, it doesn't have to be like this company aims to comply with GDPR. So I think that goes really to illustrate the realistic part, because of course we should all aim to comply with the GDPR, but it doesn't say that we have to, because that might not be realistic in the beginning. Of course, we want to, down the road, be 100% compliant, but if you haven't done anything, then the first step is to just get the basics done, and then you might not be 120% compliant with GDPR, but that's just the first steps. And then you can...
There could also be another objective, another definition of that, say, well, we have to comply. We have to make 100% sure that we are complying with all regulations.
Yes.
And some organizations might say, well, we, as it says here, we aim to comply.
Yeah.
But again, that's the definitions, and that's where you really have to. So I think this objective part is where you really have to spend most of the time. But there are some kind of, I would really some best practices in here. I would definitely recommend that you keep let's do a risk-based approach. So as we've discussed in earlier episodes, that's where you really start thinking about, well, how do we actually use the framework of risk assessment to plan our information security. And then I would also really encourage you to say, well, for our information security, we really need to start developing a handbook, kind of a playbook, or a manual, there's a lot of different names for it, where we start describing what things are we doing in terms of information security, because that's really where it becomes concrete, and you really start. You can really then lay out, well, what are we actually doing, and why.
So I think the risk analysis is also a way of figuring out what should the objectives be. And I think the last objective in the template is also that you should review this policy every single year. So it goes into, it's a cycle thing. You can always update the objectives when you complete them.
And the objective could be more and more ambitious over time. You could say, well, we could start with saying we want to aim to be compliant with GDPR, and then kind of a year later we say, well, we definitely need now to make sure that we are compliant with GDPR. And the first step could also be we want to try to do our work in accordance with ISO. And then for next year you could say, well, now we really are confident that now we want to make sure that we get a yearly statement that we are compliant, that we get an ISO certificate, or we get a ISAE 3402 declaration from an IT auditor saying that we actually comply with these frameworks.
So it's just to illustrate that it depends on where you are in your journey, your cybersecurity journey. But of course, the end goal after X amount of years should be that you comply with the GDPR and maybe also have some kind of statements.
But I think this is really, when you set these objectives, you obviously have to kind of, depending on where you are in your organization, you have to get the management on board. And that's kind of the next part of this policy, is where we start defining on who actually is responsible for what in the organization. And for a lot of companies, it's, I would say, wrongly just assumed that everything relating to information security is actually just it's the responsibility, the final responsibility is in the IT department. And I think that's a little bit of a misconception, because yes, they might have the responsibility for kind of the operational work, but in the end responsibility often actually lies in the board. And I think that's a really good discussion to actually start having internally and say, well, it's not something that the board can just push down and say, well, we'll just assume that someone else has a good way of working with information security. It's actually something that, and also some of the legislation that is coming, like NIS2, that's something where it's actually defined, well, there is a board level responsibility for information security. So again, the policy really makes it possible that we have that alignment, who is actually responsible for what.
Yes, also just because it is critical for the whole business. So of course, some of the responsibility lies with the board and the ownership of the company. So that was jumping into the responsibilities. And one of that is that who is the main responsibilities. But like you said, the IT department might be the operational part. And then that's their responsibility. But it could also be all the way down to the individual employee. What are they responsible of? Because they also have some kind of responsibility when it comes to cybersecurity work.
Yes. So I think that ties then together with the guidelines. So it would be, for a lot of companies, just makes a lot of sense to say, well, we have these different responsibilities starting from the board to the management to the IT department, and now all the way down to the individual employees. But what is actually the responsibility of the individual employees? That is to comply with the policy and to comply with the usage policies, the guidelines that are actually set forward by them.
Exactly. So you actually get like the full funnel of who should do what and who owns what.
Yes,
as well.
I think there's another point that's relevant to also kind of just touch upon here is the definition of ownership.
Yeah.
Is that it's in a lot of companies today you have digital assets across the company. So in the traditional, IT could own and could oversee all assets, but today, realistically, you have assets in finance department. They have their own ERP system.
Yeah.
You have marketing might have their website. IT might have the servers, but you could really see that there is ownership for assets that could have some information security needs or kind of angles to it across the whole organization. And therefore, it's important that we also assign the ownership of these assets to the different departments and saying, well, yes, marketing, you might own the website.
Yeah.
But then you also, if you own the website, it's also your responsibility to make sure that the website is operated and managed in compliance with the security policy. And you're then welcome to bring in the IT department to ensure that.
Help.
But in the end, it's your asset, and therefore you are ultimately responsible for that asset.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it also takes, the whole way the myth about IT department owning everything.
Well, I think realistically, it's just not possible. But it's also when you receive that ownership, you receive that responsibility for an asset, then it's also your problem.
Yeah.
It's not fair to say that IT department should be responsible for all risks across all different assets if they have no realistic way of actually managing those assets.
Exactly.
And so that's where we say, well, IT department, we'll make sure that we help you if you have an asset, if you have a question. But in the end, it's your responsibility to make sure that you actually comply with the security policy. And if you can't take that responsibility, then then you can't take the ownership of that asset.
Yeah.
Then the ownership might stay with the IT department, but then you might be kind of limited some way. Then you always have to go ask for permission if you want to do something, because it's the IT department's responsibility then to make sure that you comply with the security policies. So I think that's a really interesting kind of point, and it really kind of the whole definition of who actually owns each asset.
Yeah. And I think now we spend some time on the objectives and the whole responsibility part, but that's also because that's where you really need to align on things. That's where you need to discuss things with the whole inside your company.
Exactly.
So it takes some time in these parts of the policy.
Exactly.
But let's try to move forward anyway, even though we could talk for hours about that. But the next one is waivers, which is when can you break these objectives and rules and responsibilities?
Yes.
And could you ever?
And I think again that's just that's just important to actually note that, saying, well, there might be edge cases where you might have to do something that then falls outside the scope of information security policy. But then it's critical to align on, well, in those cases, what should you then do? Is it the IT department that grants you that way of saying, well, you're allowed to step outside the normal rules? Is it the management? Is it the individual system owners asset owners that can take that decision? Or is it even something that has to go up all the way to the board to do that? So again, that could be completely dependent on what works in your organization and what kind of assets you operate. But at least let's have that discussion about when we want to step out of the rules, who should then be involved?
Yes. And then the next part is the whole reporting of the work. So who should report what to who?
Yes.
And I think it makes sense that, of course, the IT department has some kind of overview of things. So they should inform maybe the executive board about relevant security breaches and so on. And you can, again, break that down into a funnel. So who should report on what? And of course, not everybody should report anything. It's really breaking down what do you actually need to know, what is the measurements, and then figure out how do we report on those measurements.
Exactly. And then I think that ties together well. If the board should take the overall responsibility for IT, then they will also start demanding, well, if I'm supposed to take the over, then I need to receive kind of updates on that on a board level, and then that should come from the IT department.
Exactly. So it should happen kind of naturally when you step out or when you map out the other parts of the policy. Then it should become quite obvious what we need to do.
But really a good, and I think that's also why we put it in here. It's a really good process to also have this annual, at least annual report on how we're actually doing regarding information security.
Yes. And the last part is the whole violation part, which we of course never hope will happen. But what should happen if a violation happens?
And I think that's again just again, like I say, it's not something that we hope to happen, but are we ready to take the consequences if people are again and again stepping outside the rules of the organization? Are we actually then do we align that could actually have some consequences for those people?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good kind of discussion to have as well.
Yeah.
So again, this policy is really about setting the scene for how do we work with cybersecurity, rather than what is it the specific initiatives that we are doing.
Exactly. And that's actually it. Then you have a security policy that is pretty straightforward and short. We don't have 20 pages of all kinds of things that nobody will ever look at and is irrelevant. This is something that you can pretty quickly put on the desk and see, are we doing these things?
Yes.
So yeah, we hope that it helps with your security policy and you get a good one in your company and get the whole board and whole company on board. And I think that's it for this episode.
I think so too.
And in the next episode, I won't have Rasmus with me. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.
I think the next one will be Sarah, who's also from here. So you can look forward to that. And remember to click subscribe if you want to follow along the journey of this podcast.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.